All right. I think we're all getting it. I'll just give our other panelists maybe 1 second to join. And perhaps the conference can give him to turn the camera back on should she need it. I'll just give her a quick message. These are some of the fun perks of virtual, is figuring out them in real time. So we appreciate the patience. There we go.
Get on.
Yeah. Welcome, Mimi.
Hi.
Perfect. Well, now we've got a full house, so I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Kroll. I work at Brown Advisory, which is an investment management firm on our sustainable investing team. And I am just so excited to be having this conversation today about the materiality of social factors in the ESG equation, and really taking a look under the hood to understand why social criteria does not receive the same attention or lip service as the siblings that sandwich them, right? The environmental and governance factors in that ESG trio, if you will. So as a quick level set, in case you somehow missed it, which I highly doubt you did, just given that we're in a virtual conference right now, we're living in a global pandemic. Part of the United States is literally up in flames, and Black folks and folks of color are experiencing extreme violence. That is not new, but it's now being filmed. And these are three major realities: COVID-19, climate change, racism, that are not happening at random or at spite of one another, but are actually happening for very systematic reasons and because of one another. The E, S, the G, they're all incredibly connected, and they're forcing investors to pay close attention to how material social factors are, or at least extremely salient in our investments, right? So this is a conversation that I don't think has been had very often or very loudly among mainstream investors or a lot of other sectors, in part because, you know, the demographics of investors are mostly white, perhaps in part because social factors are sometimes hard to quantify, and maybe because the foundation of many investments in corporate behavior have these real ties to putting profit over people, despite evidence that you can have both, that we'll hear about today. And I think that's just why we're so lucky to be joined by these three experts on how social factors come into play in investments and in sustainability, and why, if you care about the environment, if you care about long-term financial sustainability, if you care about the people you work with or and employ, social factors are worth your attention too. So you've seen their bios, but very, very briefly, as there is much to be said about each of these extremely talented women. Dr. Mimi Parker is a retired fish and wildlife biologist and a member of many boards, including Brown. Amira Woods is someone who wears several hats with a very rich background, including being a senior advisor at Shine, as well as being a scholar and advocate specializing in social impact and innovation. And as I learned yesterday, a graduate of Columbia as well. So if we have any fellow students there, I think you've got a good friend in Amira. And then, of course, we have Caroline Reese, who is the president and co-founder of Shift, a nonprofit that focuses on corporate impact on people. And I thought, to kick us off, Mimi, I would love to just hear from you to personify, I think, and humanize this conversation a bit. Why are social factors so important to you, and how have you seen them at the intersection sustainability throughout your career in academia, in conservation, and most recently in investments?
So I'll start by just, people often ask, where did I come from as a fish and wildlife biologist? And so I'll just spend a little bit of time about my career, not much, but I grew up in a very, very poor region of this country in the Mississippi Delta. And my mother was an avid angler and she taught me to fish. We were very, very poor. But she also taught me the value of conservation. And then she died when I was fairly young, and I decided to study and also go into conservation in her honor. And as a fish and wildlife biologist in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, and the Midwest, the Great Lakes, I had a lot of opportunities to watch Fish and Wildlife Service, the profession. I've watched environmentalists, and for the most part, this has been 40 years now, and for the most part, they focused on the science. And they were excellent scientists and they did excellent science work. But what I've seen recently is a shift, and that shift moved from just focusing on the science, but thinking about the people perspective too. And so as I look and watch them over the years addressing climate change too, that was one other area where they started, where they first we had the deniers, right? And then we moved from the deniers to those individuals that actually believed that there was such a thing as climate change. And then we focused on the animals again, the fish and wildlife. We focused on the vegetation. And then finally, we realized that we needed to look and see what impacts that we were actually having on the people. The sea level rise that we have in different parts of our country. We're looking at the flooding that we have. And people realize that this is going to be a big problem for us. They looked at the invasive species, those species that were moving north, that were once only found in southern states. But again, only focusing on fish and wildlife. And then finally on the people. And then finally, the aha moment came where they realized that many of the vulnerable populations were going to be impacted by climate change. And so then they realized they needed some different skills. And what I've learned about many of the people in conservation, that they love animals, they love outdoors, they would prefer to be by themselves, lacking emotional intelligence for sure. And so when we think about investments and we think about profits, on the environmental side, for the most part, many of my colleagues only thought about what it meant in terms of numbers, in terms of species. And finally, they're realizing that there are opportunities for us to look at climate change, environmental justice, but not just how it affects vulnerable populations, but just some of the history in this country of things that companies have done in the environmental world. I was born in 1957, and really, my mother had named me after the first lady, and she was really impressed with President Eisenhower because he took put troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, to escort those girls and boys into Little Rock Central High School. And what was amazing was Eisenhower also started the interstate system in this country, putting highways everywhere that we're all enjoying today. But when we think about environmental injustice, that's an example of what happened. Most of those highways were placed in communities of color, and they displaced a lot of people of color when they did that. And again, we were looking for the best alignments for these highways. We weren't thinking about how we were actually disrupting communities, and we've seen the benefits of that. And so I really believe that over time, if we look at the transition, when we think about the conservation community, it's moved from just thinking about a wildlife, thinking about the science, into thinking more about the impacts that it has on people. Many of the toxic waste sites that we have in this country are in communities of color. And so investors never challenge anyone. Companies didn't challenge any of their employees to say, why are they here? I live in the Washington, D.C. area, not too far from Baltimore. Recently, I recall working with a group of high school seniors, and students in an environmental club at Ben Franklin High School. And they realized that they were about to put an incinerator in their neighborhood. And they organized. They said, we don't want it here. We see all the environmental impacts associated with that, but they also made the connection to the human impact and the medical conditions, the asthma that the people in those areas got. And so they were able to organize and make a difference and get that incinerator out of their neighborhood. And so the environmental movement has transitioned over the years and moved into what I see is that they're a little bit more people focused. There's still room for more in doing that, looking at the social economic impacts of vulnerable populations. Now, I'm also fortunate to be on 7 boards, one of which is the Nature Conservancy, one of which is Brown Advisory, as you said earlier. I watched the Nature Conservancy here in Virginia purchase land in the Cumberland Forest, over 253,000 acres of land. Now, 10 years ago, that land would have been there for the protection and for those exclusive group of people that could afford to hunt there and go there, and enjoy the land, but not something that they thought about other people in that area. But this time, working with Brown Advisory, the Nature Conservancy found investors to help purchase the property. And now they're going to be looking for jobs for people in that area. And they're going to be talking and working and creating jobs for the coal miners and those people in the coal industry so they can find jobs. So not only are they creating habitat for fish and wildlife, but they're also creating jobs in the area. Brown Advisory has done a lot, and they're thought leaders throughout the industry in this. I celebrate, they have some superpowers there, if there are such things. When we see the CEO of the company, he certainly put the S in ESG when he spoke out and did a TED Talk, and he talked about what happened in Charlottesville. That was important to him. But basically, he's also very responsive. Mike Hankins is very responsible to the people of color in his organization and Brown Advisory. And he's worked with a great group of, believe it or not, most of the people I work with are women right now. And they're in leadership positions like Catherine, like Dune, like Karina. And I turn on CNBC and there Karina is talking about the fact that Brown has determined that we can invest and in sustainable investments and still perform, and in many cases outperform our traditional investments. And so it's not an either or. We're able to make some investments and still look out for making profits as well. It's not where we're making a compromise. And so that's important to do. They're also doing a good job of sharing their information with others. As thought leaders, they realize that this is not enough for us to keep this information in-house, but we need to share it. But they're also training others in the company to understand how they can approach the private clients and that they will have the knowledge that they need related to environmental investments, sustainable investment, and doing a great job there in some good training. But the key is all about being equitable. It's all about being open. It's all about being responsive. It's all about, again, having that emotional intelligence, as I see, that's important to make a difference when we think about, this type of investment. And I know you mentioned earlier, Catherine, as I finished, that we're always worried, particularly as scientists and people that deal with numbers, we're always concerned about quantifying and making sure that we have those numbers. And so as I think about where we are putting the S, we've heard the middle child, it is, into ESG, sometimes we may not always have those numbers, but if we think about some of our investments in the past, we've used some of our gut feelings, right? And we know that we're doing the right thing when we make sure that we have climate equity, when we make sure that our people in human resources are doing the right thing, that they're having an inclusive environment. And we know that we're doing the right thing when we look out and make sure that the folks in our supply chain are really being treated fairly. And we know that we're doing the right thing when we are saying no to some investments that are not really in companies that don't really care about the social environments and the social injustice. So that's where I see things right now. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. I saw them and talked to them yesterday, and I'm excited to hear some of their thoughts on the subject.
Thanks,
Thank
Mamie.
you for having me.
That's super helpful as always. Whenever I listen to you, I always have, no less than 20 follow-up questions, but I'll save some of them for the end because I'm sure other folks do too. And if I could just ask you and Caroline to go on mute when you're not speaking, because I have a question for Amira now, just based on all of the great info you just shared with us. I want to come back to a bunch of what you said, but Amira, I wanted to focus on some of what Mamie pointed out around the intersection of injustice and intentionality, and how we see a lot of data that supports the idea that a lot of this injustice is just not happening randomly, but there are forces underway that are making it a reality. And so, Mamie mentioned we don't have all of the hard statistics that we might have around climate change, but we do know that there is this broad mosaic where, at least in the United States, Black folks are 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19. They're more likely to die from mortality, and they're more likely to die from air pollution as it results to some of those harmful plants and chemical exposure that Mamie spoke about just a few minutes ago. And so when you put that all together, I just would love to hear your perspective on what role justice plays in thinking about the materiality of some of these investments, and if justice is material or if it's not, how should investors be thinking about it either way? And of course, would love to hear just a little bit from you on your understanding of the social factors as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. This is it's such an honor to be part of this panel, to learn Remo and this whole new platform, and even having the cat walking back and forth. But it's just a joy to be on with you phenomenal women, I must say, and just to underscore. As an alum of Columbia, it's really a joy that Columbia is hosting this. I'm sorry we're not on the campus, but the virtual platform will do for now to keep everybody safe. So thank you to all the organizers, but especially to Catherine and to Brown Advisory for making space for this conversation. So you all, I want to to put it out there up front. I believe justice can and must be at the center of all our decision making when it comes to investments, when it comes to finance, when it comes to building the world that we want. Our indigenous community, they say, think 7 generations down. If we're thinking about the world we want 7 generations down, we've got to put justice at the center of everything we do. So let me just back up and say, I love going back to my Columbia roots, right? Professor Eric Foner, who's an incredible historian. I took a class with him way back in the day. Recently, a couple of years ago, started to do research on universities, but especially Columbia and Columbia's role in finance, where the original financing came from for Columbia's investments. I think we all know this, but he just unearthed it and wrote a beautiful book about it. So Ebony and Ivy is one of the books that comes to mind if people aren't familiar with this, right? But essentially, we all know this. It's the slave trade. We have a racialized capitalist system that has been built on the backs of free labor of Black and Brown people around the world, that has been built on the resources of communities in Black and Brown communities around the world. And thirdly, that has actually benefited from the underpaid and unpaid work of women. So when we talk about justice, it's about looking historically at where we've come. So, investments that you see now at Columbia or any of the 27 universities that are part of this research consortium, we've got to look at the source and understand where those investments derive. And we've got to begin, we say remember, but it's one of my historian friends says this, remembering, putting together, reconnecting the limbs, right? Putting together the pieces. It is remembering that it is on this racialized system that we built an economic model that now, surprise, surprise, works for 1%, works for the very few. And it tends to be 1% that are largely male and largely white. Let's be clear, right? So what we're talking about when we talk about justice is examining that frame and understanding our power, seizing our power as academics, as investors, as practitioners, to say, not on my watch. And we are at an extraordinary moment in history when the world, as Catherine so beautifully put it as we began, the world is facing this multiple crises. We see before us the COVID crises, that is this global pandemic that we all knew was coming, right? Global health experts have been saying for decades, it's coming and that there will be more, right? We are also, as Mamie so beautifully reminded us, we're also in the midst of a climate catastrophe where the UN made it quite clear that we have now less than a decade to avert total chaos, right? And we recognize that the painful history of kind of dehumanizing human beings is so evident all around us today, not only in the United States, where the Black Lives Matter movement has risen, thankfully, in such powerful force, but globally, recognizing that the injustice cannot hold, must not hold, and future generations are demanding change. So, so the question is basically, yeah, it's a grim picture of all of these crises, right? But many of us, as academics and as practitioners, we believe in the power of people to bring change. We believe in building institutions that work for the public good. And we believe that a different way is possible. So, what can we do? There's a lot, and I hope we'll have time to go through all of that. But the first is kind of understanding the context and not being shy to confront it openly, right? We've got to name it, otherwise we won't be able to actually address it. Two, there's so much that can happen. We've got extraordinary evidence now from Stanford University and Illumine Capital, thankfully, for all the great work that they're doing. Their research basically shows that 2%, are you all listening? 2% of investments are controlled by women and people of color. 2%. Now, I don't think I need to remind everybody, but women, we say we hold up half the sky, but we're about 51% of the global population, right? People of color, Black and brown people, are about 70% of the global population. 2% of investments managed and controlled by our people, our communities, our women. So I think we've got to understand what that means. That means that decision-making is reinforcing historic patterns that have been exploitative and that have been disastrous for people in communities around the world. So, that's a kind of US framing. I'm from Liberia, so I often like to bring in the Liberia context. I think it's important in this audience to say, if we think about global finance and sourcing, the example for me always is, because I, like Mamie, grew up in a rural area, first few years of my life, right, in Liberia, under what we say, under the shades of the Firestone plantation. It was literally a plantation. It still is today a plantation since 1926, right? The largest rubber operations in the world, without which you would not have tires for cars or planes or any other rubber products you can think of, right? Largest operations in the world in Liberia. 1 million acres in 1926, 1 million acres. Can you imagine? People on whose land, those were ancestral lands. People were tossed off their lands, made to be cheap labor to help extract rubber, right? To take rubber from trees, it's like the maple syrup running right out of the tree. To tap those trees, put that rubber on a ship, send it to America, right? We now have a parent company that's not Firestone, but it's Bridgestone, but still the process remains in place. The rubber is put on a ship, sent to America. The community is suffering and has been for now, listen, over 8 decades, the harmful effect of the chemicals that are poured into the river after they've been used in the treatment of the rubber so that it can make its way to America, right? Chemicals dumped in the riverways that people are drinking from, right? So you have the land and the rainforest cut, and all the climate impacts of that. You have the riverways destroyed, and you have communities bearing the brunt. Not only that, you have had companies that are now focused on child labor, essentially, to produce the product. So we've got to think about we've got to think about the S, right? We've got to think about the people, and in so many ways, stand with those who are themselves at the forefront, saying enough is enough. We demand a different way. So the time is short. 10 minutes goes quickly, but I think we'll be able to come back and give further examples and hopefully further encouragement for what all of you as academics and as people of concern and people of conscience can and must do.
Mira, thank you so much. I think one of the powers of the S in ESG is unlike the E or the G that can sometimes feel somewhat abstract, or you need to have a higher degree to make sense of the climate numbers. I know I pour myself over them often, and it's easy to get confused. With social issues, they are right here and now, and they tie the two together and just are extremely palpable. And you hear that in the story that you share. That is still a story that it has as much credibility as environmental factors do, but it just also has that very lived element as well. And so thank you for bringing that to light. Caroline, I think you're teed up really well here, because we've heard from Mamie and Amira that the case for urgency. We know the problem. We know that people's lives are being impacted in really severe ways, and also in maybe some more surface level ways, but it's there, right? And we know that these issues are incredibly interconnected. So it makes sense that companies are really having to grapple with them. And I think because these issues are so powerful, it's easy to get paralyzed. I spend a lot of time chewing on this idea of how do we hold people accountable while still believing in their capacity for transformation, which I think I badly butchered from Audre Lorde. But when in your work with Shift, which I'd love to hear more about, I think you're really tasked with that transformation part. So you take the work that Mamie and Amira just laid out, and you actually help translate it into action. We've seen in the last few weeks and months a lot of proclamations, a lot of signing on of pledges, but what is that sticky place between policy and action? And so, Caroline, if you could just walk us through how you take this urgent problem and work with companies and other stakeholders, since I know it's not refined just to companies, to really implement change.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And first, just, what a pleasure to be in the conversation today, and with such extraordinary women on this panel. It's a privilege, and just learning so much as well from what others are sharing. And I mean, you're so right as you hone in that. I mean, your point there, Catherine, as well, about how abstract some of these areas can see. And we frame up at Shift as a non-profit the area we work in as business and human rights. And guess what? Human rights can sound pretty abstract and a bit geeky and so forth as well. And so I'm constantly coming back to say, yes, it is just about impact on people. That's what we're talking about here. And how does the language of human rights help us? It helps us because it says, if you're going as a company to look at anything amongst the impacts, the effects you have on people's lives, focus on those that rise to the level that they affect people's basic dignity and equality, right? If you're going to do anything, surely we want to go there. And Amira, to your point of justice, right? We've got to go to those issues where it affects basic justice in our societies. You referred there as well, Catherine, to pledges that are coming out, and where already before COVID, we were in this conversation about stakeholder capitalism, right? If we think about this arena of investing and what does it mean? Well, not just about those returns to shareholders, but also the other stakeholders affected. And yet, as we talk about those, again, we get to these broad categories of people: employees, suppliers, communities, consumers. And I think what really for me is resonant, listening to Mamie and Amira and thinking about what we do in our work, is that it's not going to change anything if we keep these broad framings, which perfectly allow for us to continue business as usual. I mean, what company doesn't look at its employees? Of course, every company thinks about employees. Every company thinks about consumers if they're consumer facing. The difference is that we have to focus on the people who are most vulnerable to harm. Right? That's what changes things. That's what the human rights lens brings. It says, where are the most vulnerable people in this situation, those most affected by the way business gets done? And so in the era of COVID, we start talking about essential workers. And guess what? They're the folks often on the minimum wages, the lowest pay, the short hours where they have to hold down 2 other jobs to make ends meet, the ones without the health benefits, the ones nominally self-employed in the gig economy, who are on the front line. These are the folks who are often most vulnerable, have least resilience in their economic situation, their health situation, on whom we rely. And we have to focus on them, not just in COVID, but after COVID. I loved the examples that Mamie and Amira shared about community impacts, right? So often when we hear companies talk about the S in ESG, and they talk about community, they're talking about volunteering in communities, philanthropy towards communities, burnishing reputation. None of that's bad, but who should we be focusing on? The most vulnerable people who are impacted by what business does and how. The folks that are displaced when the highways are built, the people that put in them through the communities of people of color, the toxic waste sites that are, again, positioned amongst those with the least economic voice, the land that is taken from the communities in Liberia who relied on that for livelihoods and so forth, the chemicals. So it's the people who are most vulnerable to harm. And I think that's what's so central. And as we work with business, and we work with business using the global standard of the guiding principles, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, that's what it all comes back to. Where are the greatest risks to people in your operations and in your value chains? Where are they most severe for the people concerned? And how do you start to go about changing that picture? How do you start to use the leverage you have in your relationships up and down your value chain with the governments of the countries where you operate to change those realities, so those harms to people are not connected to your products and your services? And I think that's really critical for what we're trying to change. I don't know if it's ironic, it's just simply a fact that when you look at the most severe impacts to people, guess what? In today's age that we live in, you also get to risks to the business as well, right? Often hear companies say that when they're looking at risks that's related to people, well, yes, of course, what we need to focus on is the first tier of our supply chain, the 80% of spend, because that's where we're exposed, that's where our big financial exposure is, our reputation exposure. It's not where the greatest risk to people is, and it's not where companies are getting hit today. They're getting called out for forced labor in their electronic supply chain, in Malaysia, in their seafood supply chain, in Thailand, for the child labor, in the rubber, in the cocoa, in those other agricultural supply chains. for sexual violence against women in tea plantations. This is, as well as it's back home in Western societies as well. We have forced labor in Western societies. We obviously have sexual harassment, sexual violence in our own societies, and displacement of communities. So these are the issues that we're focusing in on, and the guiding principles give us a framework for understanding what business is expected to do, to identify these risks based on risk to people, to mitigate those risks using their leverage, and then to work out, to track, as we say, what's working and what isn't. And that brings us right back to the S in ESG. We're not terribly good in this field at measuring what is meaningful. We're rather good at measuring what's easy to find out. So we have an awful lot of metrics that are about inputs and activities and outputs, numbers of hours of training done, numbers of factories, whether we have this word or that word in a policy, whether we have a process called this or that. And we get confused, I think, between things that companies need. They need policies, they need the processes, they need to do the training. And on the other hand, things that actually tell us if change is happening. Right, and we measure the first and not the second. So that, I think, is the next big move, is to get much more meaningful about what we're evaluating and how we're understanding what change actually has to look like.
That's really helpful, Caroline, and I think it ties together the thoughts that we've heard today, taking us from problem to causation to potential solutions. I want to come back to this idea that I've heard from all of you now, which I think is something like the difference between intention and impact. And Brown Advisory is a for-profit firm. We manage, about 90 billion in assets under management, and Mimi, you mentioned earlier our CEO, Mike Hankin, who I feel very lucky to say has charged this firm with the task of getting it right, getting the S in ESG right, and getting the question of really understanding how we can treat one another with the equity that we all deserve. But that next step that Caroline, Shift does a lot of work on, the translating it from, showing up. And I think we're at this inflection point where more people are willing to show up than ever before. How do we turn that willingness, whether it's, for investors like me that have the support of my company behind me, to have conversations with companies and issuers and say, this is what we need to see from you, or academics who are able to provide the kind of research investors need, or companies who are willing to take that first step. What are those gaps? And if you had one ask for investors or for academics or for companies, what would it be? And I'd love to just hear quickly your high level thoughts, all three of you. I know we just have a short amount of time here, but what would your ask be to take that first step? What does that first step look like for investors, companies, or academics? Dealer's choice.
So I think that first step is to bring the right people to the table to have the discussion, and not only bring them there, but make them feel welcome, make them feel valued, make them feel like they really matter when they're there, and move through the discomfort levels of where people don't feel comfortable talking about issues. That allyship, we really need people that are at that table to feel like they're being heard and that their opinion matters. And so that's how I would start. And I'll give you one example of that before I leave. Solar sightings. We sat down with an environmental education, an environmental organization here in Virginia, and they were talking about, we need to strategically make some recommendations on where to site the solar panels in this state. And somebody right away said, we'll just do them all on brownfields, and all on in brownfields. That's the best place. And then there was somebody at the table who was an ally, a white person, said, but wait a minute, many of those toxic waste sites were back in the 60s, 70s, they were placed in communities of color. So now you're going to put the solar panels there too. That's not aesthetically pleasing. And why would you do that? So they realized, well, oh, we don't have the right people sitting at this table. We don't have everybody here. So bring the right people to the table that can have a voice and that can speak for their communities and their thoughts.
I think that lines up nicely with Amira's comments on only 2% of women and people of color really managing money. That lack of representation is grappling with as an industry and broader, of course. Amira, feel free to speak more to representation, but I wonder, if you take that one step further. I know that there is this real obsession around getting more women on boards as a way to bridge the gap of female representation, and that would trickle down into the culture of organizations. But there's some data that says maybe that's not the case. So with the understanding that representation is one important part of the equation, what else needs to happen in an organization's culture for that representation to really land?
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree wholeheartedly with your comments already. But I do think it goes beyond diversity, because I think you've got to, as investors, understand it's your fiduciary duty, right? It's like, it's not sort of an aside, right? Like something we would like, but it is your duty to recognize that the economic model that we're on that benefits 1% is not sustainable for the planet, and it's not for sustainable. And we've got to, if we're going to uphold any kind of fiduciary responsibility, we've got to say, what is our role in advancing a different vision of what the world needs to look like, right? And so I think it is critical to understand that, throughout ages, from the very slave trade to apartheid, to Jim Crow here in the United States, it was people at the forefront saying, we're not going to take it anymore. So when we talk about changing the model, it's shifting the power that we need, right? It's understanding that it's your fiduciary duty to shift the power dynamics so that we are building a more just and more equitable world. Because without that, it's not sustainable. It's the planet is in chaos. There will be more global pandemics, and the inequality will persist for generations to come. Now is the time. So I say, frame it as your fiduciary duty, and urge action. And the action can come in multiple ways, right? Including the diversity piece, but it's got to be attacking the model, understanding that this is a long-standing problem that's got to be addressed with a structural, systemic commitment to change.
Thank you, Amira. Caroline, can you take us home?
Yeah, well, first to echo the points raised, one of the things we are often talking about as we discuss with companies how to know if the change they're trying to drive around risk to people in their operations and value chains is making a difference is design indicators with the people who are affected, right? Don't design them for them, because it compounds that disempowerment, that lack of agency, and just that lack of understanding of what the lived experience is. And to the comment that's been raised in chat, yes, being aware of how people are differently affected, including people with disabilities, right? Often not a voice in those conversations. LGBTQ people, often not a voice in those conversations. So design with the people affected. Second, one of the things we see a lot, and we're doing a lot of work around now, is leadership and governance, right? Because respect for people is not a compliance exercise, and the companies that approach it as a compliance tick box exercise get it wrong. It's about behaviors and mindsets. It's about culture, and that comes from the top. So one of the things we're looking at are indicators of leadership and governance that leads to a culture of respect for people. That's really important for us to get our hands around much more concretely. And finally, I think another really important area here, and it comes back to an earlier comment about the need to know to evaluate what's happening in this field is very often in the environmental field, we've got very clear targets set by companies. And they'll say, this is our greenhouse gas emissions target, this is our water usage target, et cetera, et cetera. They're measurable, they're clear, they're transparent, and they get reported out against. And then we come to people, and we will continue to engage with, we continue to value, it gets very fluffy and vague and not measurable and not accountable. And there's no reason for that. Just because it's not a science in the same way or science-based in the same way, there's no reason to be vague and nondescript in these ways. I think we need to really have some clear criteria for companies to set good and robust and measurable targets. And guess what? In measuring progress against them, it's going to come back to engaging with the affected communities, people of color, women, disabled individuals, and so forth, to gather the insight as to whether you're making a change, right? It's not just the numbers, it's qualitative feedback too, but there's no reason not to have clear targets, and there's no reason not to measure and demonstrate progress against them.
Thank you, Caroline. I couldn't agree more. I also think about some of the questions that were in the chat around, how do you deal with companies who pledge allegiance, but then the talk? And there was another question asking about how are we nudging clients and helping them understand the value add of ESG investing. And I think to both of those, as we've heard today, the proof is in the pudding. We now know that companies that pay attention to these types of social factors have actual value adds in their long-term performance and even their short-term performance. This is a right thing to do and a good thing to do, which I think helps seal the value proposition. We know that companies that have more diversity, be it able diversity, be it racial diversity, age diversity, social economic diversity, they are more likely to have higher revenue as it relates to innovation. So that just goes behind this idea that having a diverse team actually helps you drive better results. And actually, when we look at the performance of a lot of these investment products that pay attention to E, S, and G issues equally, they're doing incredibly well, especially in the pandemic. And to drive that home, I think UBS, a co-sponsor of today's event, actually announced that they would be recommending sustainable products over traditional products to their private clients. And this isn't just because it's a nice thing to do. As Amira said, it's part of the fiduciary duty. And someone from UBS, please fact check me if I butchered that, but I did recall seeing that in the headlines. So all of that to say, this inflection point is really, really building.
I wanted to weigh in on that because I think that,
please,
Catherine, and I'm honored to be a trustee of the Wallace Global Fund, which is a leader in getting foundations to do two things. First, to not keep all the money in an endowment when now in the midst of COVID, it's needed most. So, encouraging foundations to spend more than the traditional 5%. Wallace Global this year will spend 20% of its endowment, and it's leading the way towards spending the money now when it's needed. But also Wallace Global is a leader in divest, invest, encouraging investors to divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewables and things that do good for the planet, right? And so the reason why I think it's critical to underscore this is, Wallace, we've actually made money, right? Wallace Global, in making this smart fiduciary responsibility-led decision, has actually increased its ability as a foundation to give. We've been able to make more money, right? And give while we live our values. So I think we have examples like that, and I'm sure the examples you talked about earlier as well, Catherine, that can lead the way. So for the investors in the room, there's no reason to not do the right thing. The examples are there, and for the academics in the room, I would say, this is work that I think young academics need to lift up these examples in the business school case studies, and let's make sure that people are understanding and able to keep walking on this path, so that we make it as as firm and as solid and into the future as we can. I just wanted to underscore those points. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And just
I think go ahead, Carol.
Sorry, Mamie. Yeah, I was just going to jump in as well to bring another angle, because I mean, we constantly gather examples of how respect for people brings opportunity, how acting without respect for people brings risk to the business. But I think also just to recognize that there can be quite different timelines here, right? And in the business decision making, there can be trade-offs. What feel like trade-offs, right? Costs of doing business with respect for people, for which the benefit and the opportunity may be down the line, or the risk avoided may never be seen because it's been avoided. And I think, not to miss the fact that there is a great deal to be gained in business from doing business the right ways. We can give businesses who've made a lot of money doing business the wrong ways. And I think that we have to also make sure we are pushing forward the idea that fiduciary duties encompass stakeholders beyond short-term to shareholders. We need to push forward the need for appropriate regulation to protect populations and avoid the continued externalization of risk onto the most vulnerable. We need all of those frameworks around it, because for the burgeoning amount of win-win examples we can produce, there are a lot of instances where in the short term, you can make some money by doing the wrong thing. And we need to be very cognizant of that.
Yeah. So I just wanted to end. I think we're getting close to it. I was just thinking about moments in history that demand change of who we are and what we are. And of course, I think Justice June was that for my generation. And because it really made us all start to think about this. And what we're seeing is that many corporations are shifting toward, of course, the S. My concern, and what keeps me up at night, is that we don't forget about the E and the G, particularly the E, as we shift to the S. That again, when you all talk about and both, that it's not either or, it's and both. And then back to the generation of things, Carolyn, you talked about phases. I'm also thinking about when I was regional director in the Northeast, and a former governor, and she was a woman, and she came to visit and wanted to appeal to us to let them build a shopping mall in Hackensack Meadowlands. And they were going to fill the wetlands, they were going to fill this stream. And it was very difficult for me, because I had looked at this one governor and had a lot of respect for her, but I had to say no. And that was a hard no. But what really helped me with this was to see those young brown and black boys and girls canoeing in the midst of New York City in a stream that they got to see a mallard duck for the first time in their life. And so that's when we know it's the right thing to do. And I think one of the bigger answers is to relearn and unlearn some of the things that we have, but also realize that it's not just our generation. We need to be thinking about the generation behind us and how we can get them to think like we do on these subjects before they get around the table to make a difference, because they will. Brown Advisory is doing that with the Gen Z and the Gen X groups of investors now. So that really warms my heart.
I love that, because I do think that's important to remember, that it is that generation. That generation is out in the streets. So the chat earlier was referencing this, right? They are out in the streets, and I believe that they are also going to seize their power in the voting booths. Right? I think they recognize the critical importance of that action as well. But I do think it's important for us to include just to remember that, that especially with this, taken by the 27 universities. 27 universities. My question is, how many are in the Global South? And how can we be sure that the universities in the Global South and young people who are incredibly innovative in the Global South are part of this conversation? So my call to everybody, right, is to think about that generation, to understand how they are grappling with so much from issues of what sexual identity. There's so much that they are at the forefront of change, and they have changed so much of the culture around the globe. So let's not forget them in academic spaces. Let's create a way that they are part of the scholarship, and that their examples and their agency is also part of the learnings along the way. This is year 3 of the so year 30 of these conferences. Let's hope that we'll have a different take because of their involvement. And I think the other thing I wanted to say is there's so much that we can do to make sure that investments are that investments are also looking at the rest of the globe, right? Looking at Black and Brown community, looking at Black and Brown agencies, companies, entrepreneurs that are trying to do things in a way that is sensitive to the environment and doing things in a different way. So, investments have to be thought about more broadly to also give more power and space to those that are trying out new models. And then the last thing is, let's make sure that key things like, let's pay the taxes, because the taxes will make sure that public health care is available. The taxes will make sure that public education is available. Let's connect all of those dots to make sure we're building out a truly just and sustainable system for everybody.
Thank you, Amira. I think all of those closing remarks are perfectly put. Amira, what I take away from yours is this doesn't get fixed by chance. We need to be really intentional about who we're inviting into this conversation, how we're investing, what we're uncovering. We talked a lot today about how social issues are abstract, but maybe they only feel so abstract because we haven't spent the time to work on quantifying some of them the way we have governance issues or environmental issues. And Caroline, I so appreciate you flagging the nuance in this dialogue, that it's not just a series of wins. If it was, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And to close, I just want to offer an anecdote from the Good Jobs Institute out of MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that found companies can make money in 2 ways. They can treat their workers really, really badly and profit off of that cost, or they can make upfront investments and treat their workers really well and provide good jobs that impact the community in a positive way, that impact their workers in a positive way, and see that return down the line and each enjoy profitability. So it comes down to this choice. And I hope that you all left this conversation feeling as empowered to make that choice, to take responsibility, as I did, thanks to Amira, Caroline, and Mimi. So have a great rest of your conference, and please be in touch with any questions.
Thank you so much.